The other side of the road is safe, where we sidestep being bothered and avoid getting involved. But rolling up your sleeves and boldly going where few dare to tread, that's walking through Samaria. Each week on our podcast, we introduce you to the special few who walk in the spirit of the Good Samaritan. On behalf of the Giving Company and your hosts, David Hendrickson and Dan Riveros, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Well, good afternoon, listeners. This is David Hendrickson. I'm with co-host Dan Riveros. Dan, hello from quarantine land.
Live and undisturbed, man. Here we are.
This is the Walking Through Samaria podcast. We are recording remotely, as we have been over the last several weeks because of the COVID-19 quarantine. And we are pleased to introduce to you very special guest today, Shane Windmire, coming at us from Charlotte, North Carolina. Shane, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Yeah, so I am going to introduce you, Shane, and we're going to dive into what's going to be a really exciting and compelling conversation. And there's one thing in particular that I am going to highlight about Shane's bio, and you'll know when we get there, everybody. Shane Windmire is a best-selling author, LGBTQ campus pioneer, and civil rights champion. He is the founder and executive director of Campus Pride, the leading national LGBTQ organization for student leaders and campus organizations working to build future leaders and create safer campus communities. Shane was raised in the rural Midwest on a farm in Hiawatha, Kansas. He was born as Shane Mendez to single mother Diane Mendez. As an American Indian, Shane is part of the Iowa tribe. He considers his family to be a mixed racial family, part Mexican, part American Indian, and part Irish. Shane Windmire attended Emporia State University in Kansas as a first-generation college student and participated in the Upward Bound program for low-income first-generation families. He graduated from Emporia State University with a bachelor's degree in communication and then attended Indiana University, whoop, whoop, where he received his master's degree in higher education and student affairs. He lives in Charlotte, North Carolina with husband Thomas Feldman. They were legally married in 2015 after 20 years together. Shane, thank you so much for joining us. How about those Hoosiers?
Yeah, go Hoosiers, exactly.
So I'm trying to think if I have brought that up to our podcast listeners in the past, but I am an Indiana University graduate and a Northwestern University graduate, so I'm a Big Ten fan, but I have two kids at Georgia, so we always wind up deferring to SEC football, which we will probably also talk about during this conversation. So Shane, to get started, we have to ask, like, if you had a dime for every evangelical Christian podcast you got invited to, huh?
Yeah, I would be, quite wealthy.
Well, we're thrilled to have you, and definitely one of the themes for today that I really want to just compliment you on right out of the gate is this idea of common ground. And you and I have never met face to face; it's only been remotely via Zoom. But one of the things that you and I have in common is Indiana. Our time at Indiana University. If you don't mind, talk a little bit about what you did at IU.
Sure. Again, thank you for, asking me to be part of this podcast. I have, been at Indiana over the years as an alum. I just love the campus. I had the fortune to go to get my master's degree at IU. I was born and raised in Kansas. Never really went to college. In my family, no one ever went.
Yeah.
And so as a first generation student, IU was overwhelming. It was just everything you ever wanted. And I had just recently, come out in my undergraduate college in Kansas. And, IU was like my big first, being an out young gay man, a professional. And I worked with the Indiana Memorial Union, which is their union board, which are a group of students who do all the big events at IU. And, my husband and I, that was our first year together, was in Bloomington, which is this amazing, diverse, culturally fantastic place. So, I look back at IU and it's really there's so much love there from, my husband and I, as well as just the community. It was a safe community. I felt welcome and included, and I just have so many fond memories.
Yeah, that's cool. You have done a ton of work on college campuses, and I want to maybe have you talk a little bit about what you've seen and experienced and what prompted you to start Campus Pride. But before we go there, one of the things that struck me in your biography is that you were adopted. And right there, like you and I going to Indiana University, we automatically have common ground. I got to imagine the support of adoption agencies and the adoption process is something that would immediately connect you with many of our listeners who support, that cause, foster care, adoptive care. Can you maybe share with us a little bit of what it was like growing up, and are you active at all in sort of the adoption awareness kind of initiatives?
It's fascinating when you think about my bio, right? So the bio that you read was one that I recently, within the last 2 years, had rewritten because I think oftentimes we all have these intersections of identity, things that, we don't talk about or that we have been told that are not significant or important, or people don't want to know about it. So the fact that, I was adopted is not something I used to share at all. It was actually a story of my mother who, when she had me as a child, she had met a man about a year earlier, obviously, who basically found out that she was pregnant and left her, right? And so, my mom was basically a single parent for the first, 6 to 9 to 12 months, but she had started dating someone who is my father. That's who I always had looked at to my father. I actually didn't know I was adopted by him because I obviously, within 9 months of being an infant, he basically adopted
That's all
me.
you ever knew, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's one of those unique stories that I never really shared because there was I don't know if it was shame or just I thought it was my mother's story and not really mine, but I didn't know until I was, believe it or not, 11 years old.
Wow.
My mom was like, I wanted to make sure you knew that, your dad, adopted you. And it was important that she told me that, obviously, but I didn't know it till I was 11. And so it's one of those parts of my story that even, up till age 11, I wasn't aware of. And it's something I really don't talk much about because it didn't matter to me because I had a loving family. My dad was always my dad, has always been my dad. And I've never, I've reached out to my biological father, if that's what you would call him. And there's just not a relationship there.
Wow. Yeah. On my side of the family, I have an aunt who didn't find out till she was about 30 that she was adopted.
Wow.
Yeah.
I also, I think it's fascinating because my mother's maiden name is Mendez, which is, obviously my Mexican American heritage. My grandfather, my grandmother, there, and we were taught during my time growing up that if you were, Mexican and you could pass as a white person, then that's how you succeed, is by going to college. Right, like that was very much ingrained. Young people today, in my opinion, have a little bit more freedom, although the discrimination's still there, to be all of their intersections. And so I reclaimed my my mother's maiden name as Mendez. And I've been trying to use that because I oftentimes wonder, what would life have been like for Shane Mendez as opposed to Shane Windmire?
Yeah. So do you think it would have been much different, or like looking back?
I think there would have been different doors that may not have been opened for me after high school or maybe even through high school. I think we have a lot of prejudice, obviously, still today. You can see it in how we treat Latinx folks, based on just their names or where they grew up. I'm very proud of the fact that my family, worked hard and was, low income. And, my grandma lived on the other side of the tracks in a small town, which basically meant, she lived across from, we had, all different types of neighbors and many of which, had, 5, 8, 12 kids. I mean, my grandmother had 11 children.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. Like, I'm Colombian American. I was born in Colombia, but I came over here when I was about 2. And I don't have a traditional, like, Latin name where it's, like, really long, where I have, like, you adopt, like, your grandparents' last name as well. It just my mom in particular wanted to be simple. She knew she was going to bring me here, so she was like Dan Riveros. That's it. No middle name, nothing. Not even Daniel. So I hear you. You know, sometimes you got to play the game, right?
But you know, it gets back to the common ground thing that you were talking about. You know, we don't know enough about each other when we talk to someone to really understand and to see that, you know, at the end of the day, we've all had struggles in our life. And we've all come from places that if we were to understand a little bit more deeply, then maybe we'd have more compassion for each other.
Yeah, exactly. So
that's well said. Can we touch on the Native American piece, Shane, just real quick, and just because we're in the middle of COVID-19, and I haven't done a ton of research on this, but my understanding is it has hit the Native American population fairly hard. What was that part of your heritage like growing up, and is that like adoption something that you are involved with or champion at all these days?
Yeah. So, you know, being part of the Iowa tribe, which if you know anything about tribal history, you know, obviously with reservations, I mean, there's a lot of really awful things that the government that has happened to Native people, you know, long before I was born. And you know, and so there's a lot of history there. And so if you look at tribal lands today, I mean, these are lands that are not really all that wealthy. You know, they have casinos potentially, but like that's the primary source of revenue. Tribal governments are not well resourced. The government has not really fulfilled on the promise to Native people. And so, you know, it's not a surprise that communities, whether they be, you know, largely people of color or people who are lower socioeconomic levels or people who are in these, we call them essential workers now. Before we called them fast food and grocery store workers, right? But now they're essential. You know, these people are low paid. You know, they're usually people of color. And the same is true for Native tribal folks, is that there's not a lot of access to healthcare. There's not a lot of access to things that maybe we, you know, take for granted in larger cities or in, you know, more populous areas of the country with jobs or you know, corporations helping. So, you know, I do think the impact, you know, to my reservation in which is right outside White Cloud, Rulo area of, you know, Hiawatha, where I grew up in Kansas. It's right on the border there of Nebraska and Kansas. So, you know, that tribes do have it difficult, and it's a lot of times because of the lack of resources and the lack of healthcare accessibility.
Gotcha.
Well,
that's a good shout out. Go ahead, Dan. I'm sorry.
No. I was gonna switch gears. I wanted to touch base on your motivation to start Campus Pride. I'm not sure if it was, you know, really just trying to be identified and more reflective of your community, or was it did something happen? Was there an issue of violence? Was there an issue of prejudice that you were coming across? Like what sparked you to start it?
Well, you know, Campus Pride for me was really an organization that I needed in college. As I mentioned, you know, I grew up, my mother worked on the reservation. I grew up in a small town in Hiawatha. You know, I graduated high school with, you know, really good grades, and I was able to be part of, you know, Upward Bound. And I slowly, you know, growing up, I felt different in that I didn't feel like I fit in. And my sexuality in college became a real struggle for myself and coming up to terms with being gay. And so at my college campus, you know, there was nothing in high school, right? Mm-hmm. But at my college campus, there were LGBT individuals, a few that were out. There was a student group. And so Campus Pride really came from that sense of, you know, that I felt of being alone or isolated and needing to have, you know, people in my life needing to have resources that could be visible, that could be proud of who they are, and to really instill that in people. So, you know, Campus Pride developed out of my own journey of wanting there to be something that could help others who might have been struggling in high school or in college find out that they're not alone. And, you know, I think we've done an amazing job as an organization, you know, to provide that since 2001 with resources and programs and services.
So this has become a great organization for advocating for college students' safety, right, on campus and providing resources, like you said. Shane, we keep coming back to this term common ground just because you've been such a champion of it amidst kind of some crazy whirlwinds, right? Political storms and media storms and all this. You've been pretty grounded and pretty principled, and I want to talk about those principles in a minute. But looking out and experiencing what you've experienced and being willing to talk to people who, like the Good Samaritan, might be of different walks of life, do you think this issue of campus safety might be an issue that both people of faith, sort of seeing how the college campus might be closing in a little bit on sort of topics of faith and students of faith and what you've experienced with the LGBTQ community? Do you think that might be one where, gosh, these two communities, these two cultures might actually be able to sort of rub elbows and go shoulder to shoulder around a really important topic?
I think the short answer is yes, but the real issue is more complicated. I speak a very social justice, progressive, LGBT visible language. Like, that's my language. I see myself as a person of faith, but I don't speak the language of faith. And I think sometimes when you don't speak the same languages, that it gets in the way of really understanding. So, what safety means to me and what safety means to maybe someone who's evangelical might be different things. And at the end of the day, I think there's another conversation maybe to be had, which is, do we share similar experiences? Are we okay with, me saying I'm an imperfect human being, and, I am committed to working across, bridges of opportunity where we can find common ground. But I am far from, I have been known to shut down a conversation. I mean, I have not been, always as open and affirming of others' ideas as I might be today. And I think there's a way to say that maybe in an evangelical way that is different from how I just said it, that might actually resonate. And I think that's the problem we have with people of faith, regardless of what faith they are, people of non-faith or people of different beliefs, is that we're not speaking the same language. And when we don't, we get easily offended and shut down conversations.
That's good. So is that sort of another kind of recommendation or another learning here, which is, hey, common ground is helpful, but it's not enough. There has to be a willingness to kind of share experiences, understand one another's language, et cetera.
Well, in college I learned, and something I've always taken with me is, first of all, I've learned that every choice has a consequence and every consequence has a choice. That's something I learned that I take to my heart today. The other thing that I learned in college is that, words don't have meaning, right? Words don't have meaning. Ultimately, the meaning that we have for words is based on our shared experience with those words. So nobody sits around and looks at a dictionary and says that's the definition of a word. They base their language, their words on their on their shared experience. And so it's very hard, and especially in a culture that is so reliant, and even now with COVID-19, on technology, that we're not able to engage in a human experience that gets to know people, in a truly authentic, intersectional, we're more than just a white, male, who lives in Charlotte, North Carolina. Like, there's a lot that goes into getting to know people. And I don't know that we're truly, on both sides of an issue, I don't know that we're truly committed to getting to know one another in truly, the way that, that faith would hope that we would, that our religion or spirituality would.
Yeah. Yeah, we say, Dan and I talk about this all the time on this podcast, and it was one of the reasons we were so thrilled for you that you accepted to join us, was this road that is sort of representative, I guess, in Scripture, with a man who is beaten and left for dead on one side and people walking on the other. We believe that inherent to the parable of the Good Samaritan is the willingness to walk across the road. And again, the way Jesus tells the story, these are not my words. This is, probably the most famous parable that Jesus told. Was you had a priest who passed by, a Levite who passed by, and a Samaritan. And I've got to imagine we sort of maybe make these things up as we go with the parables, that the Samaritan knew that was a Jew. And at some point, maybe not when he was by the side of the road, but certainly by the time he checked him into a hotel and paid the wages for a day or two stay until he was better. And to me, there's so many things that can sort of be described by that road. And at the end of the day, there isn't any description or difference that should prevent somebody from walking across the road.
Yeah, I think that's truly, truly inspiring and such a great way to look at taking that, because there is ultimately a risk, and it's a risk because of the world that we live in to kind of cross that road. I mean, Dan Cathy took that risk in what I have done with Chick-fil-A, in crossing the road and wanting to talk to me. I took that risk in crossing the road and wanting to talk to Dan. And it's a sad world that we live in, especially from a standpoint of faith, if we can't engage or we can't try to learn and understand, other people. Because, ultimately, my faith is one that, looks at truly growing. I talked about it in the piece I did for Huffington Post, this blessing of growth. Yeah. Right. And that's not language that I speak in often, but, this idea that, there is understanding and growth and ways that you can, bring change to yourself, but also, maybe live in a world that is improved because of something that you've done.
Yeah, that's good.
That's good.
Can you talk, Shane? And so maybe we should sort of, come out on this one and tell our listeners that this is the Shane Windmire who engaged with Dan Cathy after, and I don't even want to put words to this because I think only you and Dan Cathy could sort of understand kind of what was going on at the time. But, us living in Atlanta, I tend to, just my bias, I'm like, well, Chick-fil-A's an Atlanta company, right? And they employ a lot of people in Atlanta and they give away a lot of money for scholarships. They can't be a bad organization. But I read this article that a good friend of mine, Troy Blackman, turned me on to. And these are your words in the Huffington Post. Dan and me, my coming out as a friend of Dan Cathy and Chick-fil-A. And I'd just love to hear it from your perspective about what it was like to get a phone call from Dan Cathy after there had been, some tough things going on between the two of you that are playing out in the world, right? Playing out in the U.S. What did you think when you first got that phone call? And sort of walk us through how you got to the Chick-fil-A bowl game of Clemson playing LSU.
Wow. So, it seems like it was so long ago, but yet, sadly, the issues, the things that we're talking about are so relevant still today because there's so much division in our world. And, I have to say that, growing up as someone who struggled with my sexuality, and I say struggled, not because I didn't want to be gay, but because, it's who I was and I wasn't able to resolve it because there was, sadly a lot of religious bigotry against gay people that told me that I was wrong, that, God made me in his image, and yet there was something wrong with me. And I was really having a hard time grappling. And, for a lot of young people, that turns to really negative behaviors of suicide or depression or, other really negative health harms. And, that was my struggle. And so I say that because taking that risk of, you know, getting a call from Dan or talking to Dan was really about me feeling like I could give people of faith, particularly people who are evangelical, or, you know, of a faith that I saw as anti-LGBT because of my background and my own history with my own, you know, you know, LGBT, the bigotry I faced growing up. It was a huge risk. And I think that's important for people to hear, because a lot of people who are LGBTQ today don't talk or engage with what they consider to be bad churches or bad organizations because of all that personal, you know, the microaggressions that still hurt them, right? And so, you know, talking to Dan, getting that first phone call, first of all, he called me. I was actually, our organization, for folks who didn't know, Campus Pride, you know, when we heard Dan go on, I think it was a talk show it was Christian based. It was, I believe, an evangelical talk show. And he was talking to, you know, other people, you know, who were Baptists, I believe. And, you know, he used some language that, again, was how evangelical people speak on, I guess, radio shows. But to someone who's part of an audience that isn't familiar with that, it was like, you know, very hateful sounding. Like it was like gays are the worst people ever, basically, and they're sinners and they're going to go to hell. And, you know, it was very wrath and fury. And I'm not from a Baptist faith or evangelical background, so, you know, I think for a lot of people it was, what is he talking about? And he's the CEO of a national brand. And, you know, we had known for a long time that, you know, Chick-fil-A had given through its foundation to groups like Family Research Council, where Tony Perkins, you know, says really awful, demonizing things about LGBTQ people, right? So when you say that gays should go to hell or that, you know, you're a abomination, sure, you have the right to say that, but that potentially can cause someone to go out and, you know, basically gay bash someone, right? Those words have harm behind them. And so, you know, we knew that Chick-fil-A had given to those types of groups. And so we started an educational campaign that basically said, you know what, if you're going to buy Chick-fil-A on your campus, you should know that it came from, you know, they fund, I think it was $10 million some dollars at the time, to these anti-LGBT organizations. So we did that. It created a huge, you know.
It did indeed, yeah.
You know, depending on what side of it, it was a mess. For other people, it was, you know, really great advocacy work. And I was talking to, I don't know if people know this, but Chick-fil-A really doesn't have operations on college campuses. They're third-party licenses. So like Sodexo, Aramark, Chartwells, you know, those are food service providers that license Pizza Hut, Chick-fil-A, you know.
Gotcha.
Right. So they're not really Chick-fil-A, you know, stores like you would find in your town or city. But we have great relationships with Sodexo and Chartwells, and those people were the brunt of our campaign, like Sodexo and Chartwells. So, you know, they were getting, you know, we had cows showing up at, you know, cafeterias and college campuses with signs and with, you know, information talking about these anti-LGBT donations of Chick-fil-A. And so I was talking to one of the presidents of one of the food service providers, and I guess Dan was trying to call in when I was on the phone with one of them, and you know, the guy who I was talking to was like, "I need to take this call. Let me get back to you here in 1 minute." And so then he comes back like 30 seconds later. He's like, "You won't believe who that was." I said, "Who?" He goes, "Well, that was Dan Cathy with Chick-fil-A," and I'm like, "Oh wow." Right. We had just been talking about Dan, obviously. That was the purpose of the call. And there he was calling. And
he was asking for your number, probably.
Well, yeah, funny you say that. So, you know, the guy from the food service provider was like, "Hey, he wants your number. Could I give it to him?" And I'm like, and I had to take a moment, right? I was like, do I want him to have my phone number? Like, I don't know this person, you know. I really had to stop. And it was that moment, you know, where I had to think and have clarity about why I was doing this. Like, why why is Campus Pride doing this? Why am I, as a person who is deeply, committed and passionate to helping LGBTQ youth, what is my purpose, right? And ultimately, what is my greater purpose of even existing here on this planet, right?
Yeah.
And so it was very powerful. And I said, sure, yeah, give him my phone number, right? At the end of the day,
this ought to be good, right? That's what you're thinking. This ought to be good.
Well, I thought, what harm can come from talking to someone? But at the same time, in our world, we're constantly, given the idea that you don't want to talk with people who don't agree with you or who are harming or hurting a part of your population. But if you look at any war or any conflict, that's the only way to create peace is by conversation. And so I had that first phone call with Dan. It was a rough phone call. He called me. We played phone tag a few times, but then we finally spoke. And what I loved about the conversation was that it was clear to me that Dan wanted to hear what my experience was. He respected me in that conversation. I expressed, he expressed our views. We listened. We had more conversations. It wasn't like a one-time thing. It actually was several dozen calls within a month. And each time I would share an incident, in a cafeteria where Chick-fil-A, the bag was thrown at a gay student and, someone said something anti-LGBT. And I could tell that that's not what Dan had intended by his language or words that maybe he said on the radio that one day. But yet, I think whether it's Dan or anyone on either side of what we call these issues, we don't think about the harm that our language creates.
Mm. Yeah. And so there's so many things to talk about. I'm sorry, there's so many things I want to ask, but one of the things that Dan and I have learned, we had Pastor Gabriel Salguero on our podcast last week. I mean, very recently. And I don't know if you know the name, but he is one of the pastors at Calvario City Church in Orlando. And he was asked by Equality Florida to come pray at a vigil after the Pulse nightclub shooting. And he's Latino, and it was Latino night at the Pulse nightclub. And that's why so many gay Latinos were killed, that night of that terrible shooting in Orlando. But there were two things that came out of that conversation that I want to highlight here as well. One is the invitation. So somebody, Dan, invited you into a conversation. Pastor Salguero was invited. He was the one invited by Equality of Florida to come pray. And what we also found out in that conversation was that he has a sister who called him up and said, Gabriel, I am so thankful that you did this a year ago. If that shooting would have happened a year ago, it would have been me that would have been killed, because she's a member of the LGBTQ community. And you have an uncle who is a minister, was a minister. Want to make sure I get that right?
Yeah, no, he still has a church. He's a minister.
Yeah. And so I talk about, Dan and I have talked about the importance of the invitation, but also there are some proof points. There are some, I wish I could find the term, use cases where you had a relationship with somebody of faith. Pastor Salguero had a relationship with somebody in the LGBTQ community. And to me, that's got to be part of it. It would have been hard for you to accept the invitation had you not known your uncle, right? I mean, because you wouldn't have had that good experience to maybe balance some of the not so good experiences.
Well, I think it's about how you're raised too, right? So I was raised in a family that, we did go to church. We were not, I would call us a la carte Catholics, right? Like we went on, every other Sunday possibly, or special occasions. Mm-hmm. But, at the end of the day, I had faith in my life. I had fraternity brothers when I came out to my fraternity in college, that were very, devout people of faith and what, from an evangelical perspective who really pushed me and pushed my buttons coming out, and we did not see eye to eye. But it's because of those experiences, along with my uncle, who his wife is my mom's sister, and so they were always around us at Christmas. And my husband and I have been together 25 years this July, right? And so I'm still very close to that. My uncle and aunt, and they have come a long way, and I have come a long way in understanding about faith. And I think that's where I'm so engaged, because I never expected. I literally ran away from my faith because of how awful I felt, because the shame I felt because of how they treated LGBTQ people, and yet. I keep brought back into faith communities because of the actions that I do. So it's like I'm trying to run away, but at the same time, I'm pulled into conversations, largely because I want to learn. I want to believe that faith is a loving place, that people, my grandmother loved being Catholic, and, it brought her great sense of understanding. So I truly believe and have a sincerity in wanting to, help people.
Well, to your credit, Shane, and I want to compliment you from this conversation and from what I've read about you, that you do seem willing to say yes, and I feel like that's an important part of potentially building some better bridges. And we are called to believe a few basic things as Christians, that everyone is equally made in the image of God, and everyone is equally loved by God, and that the two most important commandments are to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And that would be what I would hope you would experience from the faith community. But Pastor Salguero was willing to say yes when Equality Florida called. The media, kind of went after him a little bit when he was there. So like you said, it comes at a cost. You take a hit, but he was willing to say yes. And you've done the very same thing by being willing to be on this podcast, by being willing to take the call from Dan Cathy. So I have to ask, first call was really rough. How do you get from that first rough phone call to you and Thomas being at the Chick-fil-A Bowl for Clemson LSU?
Well, first of all, my husband Thomas didn't go. But my good friend Christian went with me. He was actually the board chair of Campus Pride, and so he went along with me. And he loves football, so he enjoyed it. Yeah. I think before I get to the Chick-fil-A Bowl, which everyone asks about, I have to say that we got there, because it took two of us. It took Dan and myself. We got there because we didn't give up. We didn't give up on each other. We didn't give up on why this dialogue, why this conversation was important. And we still haven't given up today. My relationship personally with Dan is still there. We just checked in with each other less than a month, 3 weeks now with COVID-19, just to make sure we're both doing well. This is a man who obviously has many, many, many things going on in his life. And he and I have both made a commitment to our friendship, to each other, and to actively learning about, for myself, this blessing of growth with faith, for him, the blessing of growth and understanding, who LGBTQ people are. And so, so that's because we haven't given up. And I think that's really important for people to hear, is that you're going to take risks. You're going to make mistakes. I got beaten up by the far left. I got beat up by I'm sure Dan got beat up by the far right. But who we were trying to talk to was this larger group of people that would be the middle ground, the people who truly want leaders, want individuals, talking and having conversations and being willing to create, opportunities for growth and understanding and finding that common ground. But, as far as the Chick-fil-A Bowl, I know that was like your big question, because
my question is really about the process. Mm-hmm. So you said you didn't give up. What were the other challenges or maybe catalysts to your relationship? Like, what were the easy things and the tough things? You mentioned like the political division in the country probably didn't help. Were you surprised at maybe some things you found that did help?
Well, what helped were even the small steps that Dan would take or that I would take to show that we were committed to each other, right? The things that we would do to show that, what we were doing mattered. I think what didn't help was, and I hate categorizing people by using labels, but these are the labels that are out there. But like, the far right, I can't remember his name. But anyway, the politicians out there who would basically take, Sarah Palin did this, right? Where she took the Chick-fil-A bag and and people sharing things, trying to speak for the company as if, the company is one voice. When in reality, they have gay customers, they have gay employees. Like Chick-fil-A is not all one, belief, right? Like there are many, as with every company, there are many beliefs, many diverse individuals who make up the company. So that didn't help when people like Sarah Palin or, that's his name, Mike Huckabee. I always space on his name, but Mike Huckabee would try to intervene and do things to show that Chick-fil-A is still this, beacon of anti-LGBT, like it could be used as an anti-safe space. And so that was not helpful. And what ultimately it took was for Dan and I to focus on what was important to us. And that was truly listening and understanding, and then taking small steps that don't necessarily take sides, but show that, Chick-fil-A is about hospitality. Chick-fil-A is about welcoming people. And, the company has a long way to go with LGBTQ people who are part of their family. They are part of the Christian family. We can't say today that Christianity is owned by non-LGBTQ people. There are many Christians of all backgrounds that are LGBTQ. And I think that's really exciting today. And, I think that what I look forward to is a world where regardless of how you think or how you practice your faith, that we could do it in a way that is civil and respectful, and that leaves the politics out of the humanity of taking care of one another.
Yeah, that's really good. And if you don't mind, can we chat about the Washington Post article?
Sure.
So this was titled 5 Simple Lessons from Shane Windmire's Friendship with Chick-fil-A's Dan Cathy. And you have 5 principles here, Shane, that I think are extremely relevant to people of faith. And then there was something that you mentioned in here that caught my eye with respect to politics that I also want to talk about, because it was another area of common ground for you and I. But if you don't mind, I want to just rattle off these five simple lessons. Do you agree with these? Because I don't think this article was written by you, so I don't want to unfairly attribute.
No, they're actually, the writer and I worked on them together.
Okay, perfect.
At the moment, I was bombarded with press, so we when this was written. But yes, they're basically a summary of the article and my thoughts.
Awesome. So here's principle number 1: let's talk to each other. Principle number 2: let's see each other as humans worthy of full dignity. I don't think there's a better Christian statement than that. Number 3: let's understand what our differences really are, and let's seek to find common ground. Number 4, I love this one: let's not be so serious all the time. And number 5, let's all be willing to give a little. I mean, those seem like 5 pretty good principles for any group of people that seem to be disconnected or at odds with one another.
I hope so. And I think that I have to acknowledge that, I did get pushback from folks for, I think, good reason around the LGBTQ community, because it's hard for me as, a man that's now like 47 years old. I pass as a white person, in my day to day. I obviously have a certain level of privilege. I have to recognize that for a trans young person or someone who's gay struggling today, that being, using terms like don't be so serious or be willing to compromise. I mean, for some of these young queer kids, it's life or death, right? Like it's a struggle on day to day. So it's sometimes about context. And I think contextually what, those simple concepts really work well, but we have to realize that, being LGBTQ is not about politics. These are real people, and they're real young kids that are struggling. And I think that's where I wish that maybe with that piece, I would have been able to contextualize it a little bit more, because I do understand that, for the young, youth of color who is struggling with their family, to come out, how being told it's not, don't be so serious, like how that really doesn't contextually fit with what I was trying to say.
Sure. But I think to some extent we can lighten up in there's sort of a cultural tendency to see things all one way. And the political division, unfortunately, has sort of reinforced that, which is if this one thing is quote unquote bad, it's all bad and everybody's bad. And if this one thing is quote unquote good, it's all good and it's always been good and it'll never be, anything but good. And the reality is us as individuals, the organizations that we work for, certainly the political parties that may receive our vote every 2 years or 4 years, they're all flawed. And part of our pretense, part of our foundation as believers in the Christian faith is that we are all flawed and we are all worthy of grace and we are all worthy of redemption and we are all worthy of forgiveness. And it just seems to me that we, particularly on social media, people are rushing to draw a conclusion and to paint something as absolute, when very few things in life that we will encounter are that way.
Exactly, including sexuality. I mean, that's the thing. I'm like, why does everyone think that everything has to be heterosexual? I mean, obviously, everything in life has gray area, and sexuality is one of those components. And, it's one of those things. I love this conversation because it's what people should be doing day to day with their neighbors, with their loved ones, is having difficult dialogue that really challenges you to be a better person, to think about how you can take ownership, not about fixing someone else or fixing someone else's problems, but how do you fix yourself to be a better human being, in the eyes of your faith. And, I have to say, let's not forget that we live in America where profits drive everything. And so people are more profitable when there's division. They're not profitable when people are at peace.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So you mentioned Dan Cathy as a follower of Christ versus a Christian. Could you maybe give us some more advice besides just being open to the dialogue to the listeners of this podcast as how they can be good Samaritans towards the LGBTQ community?
Wow, that's a great question. I have tried to learn so much about the language of Christianity, about the evolving language of Christianity, and about what is evangelical, what is a follower of Christ, what is all that about? Like, what does that truly mean? And what I've learned is that just like LGBTQ people, there are different meanings and experiences. And so, I think you have to be willing to be engaged and have the conversation. You have to be understanding that just because you're talking to someone who identifies, in the LGBTQ community, doesn't mean everyone feels that way. It doesn't mean everyone shares the same experience. And so, that nuance is really important. But at the end of the day, it's about having that conversation, building a relationship around common ground. And I think earlier you were talking about this. One of the reasons why we don't engage and take that risk is because we've lost trust in each other. I think we've lost trust in humanity. We've lost a connection that builds that trust.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes it's about, simple things that, I have neighbors in my neighborhood, right? Like sometimes I get to know my neighbors because a tree falls in our yard or their yard and we go over to help them out, right? Those are the simple things that build trust, those types of things in relationships. Don't go to people just say, I want to talk to you about this difficult subject, right? Like that, if that's your first conversation, it's going to be hard to build trust. Go to them as someone who wants to learn and know them, just like we used to do, I guess, or how I think my grandmother used to do things, and she knew her next door neighbor like they were family. Now, did they argue? Yes, they argued, but they also, celebrated together, and that's a part of. I don't know, you could call it maybe Christianity. I would call it just life and treating of each other, as good people. But, I think faith, in the understanding that I have of it should, allow people to have the type of relationship building and building that trust that is lacking.
Yeah. Well, our listeners have heard me say this, hopefully not too many times, but I think that's what the parable of the Good Samaritan is all about. And if we're going to heed Jesus's teaching in that parable and all his parables, there is a call, there is a strong call, a directive to loving your neighbor. And what I love about the parable, again, our listeners have heard this a million times, is that, in that parable and so much of the theological support for it since that time has been, you're supposed to love your neighbor, whoever that may be, whenever they may present themselves. And that's it. There isn't any disqualification in that parable. And therefore, in my opinion, not any disqualification for anybody to be experiencing the love and the grace of Christ.
And you mentioned a million times, maybe it'll take a billion or a trillion till we get there.
Probably.
Stop mentioning that. I think it's a beautiful message. I'm so proud of being part of your podcast. You didn't ask me though, what was the Chick-fil-A Bowl like? We didn't get to that question.
You have to tell us. And who you were rooting for, by the way.
Oh, goodness. So I have to own up to the fact that, when it comes to sports, people on the far left are like, well, Dan Cathy wooed you by taking you to the Chick-fil-A Bowl, and you were wooed by all his money and his power. And, I had people on the left who were really just grasping at straws, like, why did you, end your boycott? And I'm like, first of all, we chose to kind of basically stop the campaign because the information had changed for us. Dan didn't ask us to do it. He didn't woo me. But after I released that piece on Huffington Post, people were like, oh, you went to the Chick-fil-A Bowl and, you were just enamored by this, this person. I didn't know how much money Dan had at the time. Enamored by this wealthy man. And I'm like, okay, if someone's going to enamor me, they don't take me to a football game. Right? Like I have to say.
Good point.
I have to say, as a gay man, I don't mind football. I played football in high school. I enjoy a football game. But, take me to a Broadway musical or take me to a concert, but don't take me to a football game. Although it was fun to go behind the scenes, to go down on the field. That was really cool. Regardless of it being the Chick-fil-A Bowl, it was cool. And that was the year that they went into overtime. Is that what you call it in football?
Yeah.
That's
it. Yeah.
And it was a really good game. My friend Christian, who's really into sports, he enjoyed it immensely.
That's awesome. Well, I remember that game well. We have roots in sort of that area of South Carolina that's close to Clemson. And one summer, 3 or 4 years ago, I took my staff to Clemson University as part of a leadership meeting that we had for 2 days. And we got to meet Taj Boyd. He happened to be there. just for that period of time. And he was the quarterback for Clemson for that game. And they beat LSU. And everybody's probably wondering why I'm so happy about that, being an SEC guy. And that's because LSU just drubbed my Georgia Bulldogs this year in the SEC championship. So I'm glad you got to see LSU go down.
Yeah. Yeah, and LSU was a purple team, right? Weren't they purple?
That's right. You got it.
Yeah, no, I remember purple and orange. That was like my base, because that's the colors of Campus Pride, purple and orange. They're our branded colors. So, and I've always been a Clemson fan just because I'm in North Carolina and Charlotte. So I would have to say I was really excited.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, as I told you, our Georgia Bulldogs are opening up against Clemson, not this fall, but next fall in Charlotte. So we'll see if you and Thomas can make it to the game.
All right. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, Shane, hey, before we let you go, because we do this to everybody that we talk to on this podcast, if somebody wants to know more about Campus Pride, follow you on social media, could you just direct them to how they might do that?
Sure. So Campus Pride, our website is campuspride.org. And you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram at the handle @Campus Pride. That's the easiest way to engage. If you'd like to volunteer, we always have volunteers. We're actually, this summer doing a lot of digital events that are more open because they're digital versus the in-person events that we'd have. So that's the best way. And as far as my personal accounts, I'm on Instagram at Shane Windmire, and that's the best way to kind of interact with me. Also, I'm on LinkedIn, I guess, if you do LinkedIn.
Well, that's terrific. Well, Shane Windmire, the founder and executive director at Campus Pride, Dan and I can't thank you enough for having this conversation that was very enlightening, and I think appropriately instructional to people of faith if we really want to make an impact here. And I'll leave you with sort of where I started, which is I am truly thankful that I did my undergraduate work at Indiana University, because as a singing Hoosier and just an active person on that campus, I still to this day have so many dear friends who are members of the LGBTQ community. And, my life is richer because of it. And they know me. They know that I'm a person of faith. They're highly supportive of our work here at Giving Company because of all the money that we give to dig water wells in sub-Saharan Africa and help rescue girls from the red light district in East Africa. And that was just a very meaningful part of my life, particularly as it relates to my dear friends in the LGBTQ community.
Yeah. I love IU. I have to say one last thing about IU since we're on the thing. So for those who don't know, gay people, LGBTQ folks today would not be where we were if it wasn't for Indiana University. Kinsey did his work at Indiana of all places. It didn't happen in California. It didn't happen in New York City, right?
Yeah, Bloomington, Indiana.
Indiana. We have Bloomington, Indiana to thank IU, someone by the name of Herman B. Wells, who allowed the research of Kinsey to even happen, why we have LGBTQ, the progress that we've had today.
Oh, that's great. So Shane, before we say goodbye, anything that personally we can be praying for you, Thomas, Campus Pride?
I think we lost a student about 2 weeks ago to COVID who was involved in our organization. He was an older adult learner. And, I think prayers for him and his family. I think, prayers for our organization. Every organization out there is struggling financially, just to continue, its operations. So it's a difficult, and I think, the prayers for everyone right now who is struggling and, staying at home. I've been very fortunate, to be able to do that. And I think as long as all of us do what we can to help one another.
That's great. Well, Shane, thank you again on behalf of Dan Riveros and I. We are thrilled to have you on the Walking Through Samaria podcast. And as the COVID pandemic continues, we pray for safety and health for you and Thomas and all of your loved ones. It has really been a pleasure.
Hey, wait, I got one more question, and this just popped in my head. I know you might
Take it away.
you might be biased, and I don't know if you guys have them in Indiana, but have you had Popeye's chicken sandwich?
We have Popeyes in Charlotte. You're putting me on the spot here.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm not touching that.
I have had Popeyes. I'm not a big fan of Popeyes.
Wow.
I don't, you know.
There you go.
My chicken sandwiches, I love Wendy's, the spicy chicken sandwich. I have to say that I love Chick-fil-A's spicy chicken sandwich. Those are the two top chicken sandwiches for me.
Okay, so you don't even place it second. You place it somewhere, maybe not even third, for all we know. Okay, cool.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I also love the chicken at Campero's. I don't know if you have Campero's, but it's wonderful.
No, I'm gonna have to try that.
We have Cane's in Athens, Georgia. They are the chicken tenders. So
yeah,
anyway.
And I think I said in my Huffington Post piece at the end, I said, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what chicken sandwich it is, as long as you're sitting down having good conversation with people.
Yeah.
There you go.
There you go. So Shane, with that, we will wrap it up. Again, this is Dan Riveros and David Henriksen on the Walking for Samaria podcast. Today with very special guest Shane Windmire, best-selling author and the founder and executive director of Campus Pride. Shane, thank you so much for joining us. It has been a pleasure. To all of our listeners, we'll see you next time.
For more content like this, visit us at givingcompany.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Walking Through Samaria.